Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Very warm welcome to the Penn Museum and to our Great Battles series. My name's Julius Caesar, and I have the great privilege of being the Williams Director here at the museum. I would also like to invite you to a public unveiling of the Lod Mosaic on Sunday at 1 p.m. So this really is the most phenomenal thing I've seen in the museum, although I've only been here 6 months. It's dated to around 300 CE. It's one of the most complete, well-preserved, and largest Roman mosaics that was ever found. It's the last stop on its US tour before it leaves for the Louvre in France. So I do encourage you all to come and see it in the coming few months or to come to our opening on Sunday. But tonight I have the great pleasure of introducing our speaker, Dr. Jennifer Wegner, one of the museum's intrepid curators who's just returned from the field from her site at Abydos. Jen holds a PhD and MPhil from Yale and a BA in Egyptology from Penn. She is an associate curator in the Egypt section of the museum and an associate professor in the Department of Near Eastern Languages, Civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania. She has published and lectured widely on many aspects of Egyptology, and she's also served as the epigrapher on expeditions to Bersha, Saqqara, and Abydos in Egypt. And, as you're about to find out tonight, she's a wonderful speaker. Tonight, her topic is From Actium to Asp, the beginning of the end of Cleopatra the Great. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Wegner.
Thank you, Julian. It's my pleasure to be here. What? Louder. Okay, I have a mic on me. Is it? Am I good now? Okay. Promise not to yell at me anymore from the. Okay. So let me find my. There it is. Okay, it's my pleasure to be here tonight as we continue our investigation of famous battles. I have to say, in planning the PowerPoint for this lecture this evening, I was a little worried that we're going to be faced with maps and busts of another kind. So I've tried to fix this as best I can without resorting entirely to using only images from comic books. We'll see how that goes. One really can't set figures as famous as Cleopatra the Great and her lover Marc Antony in a battle, and not have all of us familiar with what happens, familiar with the confrontation and how this turns out. We can play Actium computer games if we want to. The Battle of Actium inspired tapestry makers as early as the 1680s, so Actium is part of all of our minds. Each of us in this room has heard of this battle. Each of us understands the events that kind of lead up to this battle, and each of us knows what the ultimate outcome of this battle was, in a way that we're not familiar with some other important ancient battles. And here you can see my Egyptological preference, like the Battle of Kadesh or the Battle of Gaugamela. Some of these battles may have been more important than Actium, maybe bloodier than Actium, maybe a little bit better recorded than Actium, but we might not be able to place the details of these battles in the way that we can place Actium. And for that, we have Cleopatra to thank, I think. And when we think about Cleopatra, we all have an idea in our mind of what she was about, what she looked like, what she did, what she stood for. We've all seen images of Cleopatra. Maybe not all of them are ancient images, but images nonetheless. And I think we can agree that most images of Cleopatra, even those as early as the Middle Ages, feature a lot of exposed skin. They usually show her in luxurious surroundings, sprawled on beds or couches, with leopard skins all around her. And there is, of course, always this questionable interaction with serpents that she's very well known for. And of course, Hollywood, and Elizabeth Taylor here, has done a really great job portraying Cleopatra for us. And we can also, here's sort of a triple threat of Cleopatra. This is Marilyn Monroe portraying Theda Bara as Cleopatra. And even most recently, Heidi Klum, whom you see here, she has her Halloween party every year, and this year Hurricane Sandy caused her to postpone it. But when she was finally able to have her party in December, who did she come as but Cleopatra? Cleopatra has been called a woman of insatiable sexual appetites, but she seems to have been really more of a serial monogamist. We only know of two men by name, Caesar and Marc Antony, that she was involved with. And she got involved with the second one only after the death of the first one. She's been called, and here you can see her, the children that she has with each of these men. She's been called a fatal beauty, but when we see ancient depictions of her on her coins and things like that, she doesn't exactly resemble Elizabeth Taylor. Even the ancient writer Plutarch hints that she may have had a nice personality rather than dazzling beauty. Now, Plutarch's work, The Life of Antony, is probably our most important source for Cleopatra's life. And while in this work she's depicted as the seductress of Antony, Plutarch's descriptions of her throughout the text hint at what may have been her real power and her real attraction. She was undoubtedly a very brilliant person, and we see this in the descriptions of her conversations. So it's her mind, her intellect, that seems to have been the real source of attraction and the source of her influence over some of these very powerful men, or so it can be argued. She's been called bloodthirsty and cruel, and she did have people killed, that's true, including most of her siblings. But this was really in keeping with good Ptolemaic tradition. This was a remarkably murderous dynasty, and so they were killing people left, right, and center. She really did seem to be a political mastermind. She was determined to protect her country, Egypt, from the Romans at all costs, and to do whatever she had to do in order to achieve this goal. She became sole ruler of Egypt around 51 BC. And she's one of only a handful of women in ancient Egypt who actually ruled Egypt on their own. Hatshepsut, whom you see here, is another very famous example that I'm sure you're all familiar with. Hatshepsut reigned about 1,400 years earlier than Cleopatra. Now, when we look at the ancient sources that describe her, some of which are roughly contemporary with her life, and others were written much later, much after the fact, what we have to keep in mind is that the majority of these writers, the majority of these sources, are people who were critical of her, people who were not writing from the Egyptian point of view. They were people who were on the side of Rome, and Cleopatra represented everything that Rome was sort of afraid of. They viewed Cleopatra as public enemy number one. They hurl all kinds of negative things at her, all kinds of accusations. And what we really see when we sort of read between the lines is that she's a woman, she's powerful, and those two elements combined with what we can see as the Roman sort of general prejudice against the East and what they viewed as the sort of debauched nature of the East made Cleopatra the very public face of everything that the Romans detested. Equally problematic is that, archaeologically speaking, we have very little evidence with which to sort of flesh out Cleopatra's life. Much of Alexandria, the city where she lived, where she died, much of it is underwater, the areas where her palace would have been and things like this. It's either been built over or it's currently at the bottom of the Mediterranean. So that's a problem there. And even as far as archaeological evidence for the Battle of Actium, it's also quite slight. There are things like this bronze prow of a ship that is believed to have come from the Battle of Actium, but again, the actual physical remains from that battle are quite slim. So tonight, given our fascination with Cleopatra, we'll take a look at this famous battle that this famous queen was involved in, and we'll examine the reasons for this battle. We'll take a look at these ancient sources that we have. We'll look at the battle itself, and then we'll examine what the aftermath of this battle was. Now, when we think about the sources, the written sources, again, there's not very much written of the time. The main sources we have are Plutarch, and you can see the dates there when Plutarch lived, far after the Battle of Actium took place. We also have works by Cassius Dio, his Roman history. Again, look at the dates of Dio and see how much later than the life of Cleopatra, when the battle took place, that he is writing about these events. And these are the two main sources that inform us on what happened at Actium. We have no sources about this battle from the Egyptian perspective. The people that are writing about it are writing about it from the Roman perspective. They're sympathetic to Rome. And we all know that adage about history being written by the victors, right? And we'll also see that modern interpretations of these ancient sources, people don't agree. People read the same text, but can't agree on what the text actually means. So there are a number of different analyses of how the battle played out and why it played out the way that it did. But first, we're going to backtrack a little bit, and we're going to try and see what beef it was that Rome had with Egypt. And, at the time of the Battle of Actium, there are a whole series of conflicts sort of swirling around at this time. And some of them are quite concrete. We know what's going on. We have the civil wars that have been plaguing Rome for decades, right? We have the long-running antagonism between Marc Antony and Octavian. And then we also have things that are a little bit harder to pin down, these sort of biases, this idea of East versus West, male versus female. And we also have to keep in mind that when we talk about the Battle of Actium, we're looking at a rising power, Rome, coming into conflict with a power, Egypt, that one could argue that sort of Cleopatra aside, its star was on the wane. The empire was not as great as it had once been. Now, despite its lessening in status on the world stage by the time of Cleopatra's reign, Egypt was still a very wealthy country. Therefore, it was a prize. It was very desirable. It was desirable for its riches, for its agricultural potential, for its stability, for its access to trade routes, and the fact that, geographically speaking, Egypt is situated in a very defensible sort of position. So all of these things made Egypt very attractive to Rome, and one can sort of trace the increasing presence or interest of Rome in Egyptian politics right from the very beginning of the Ptolemaic dynasty. So Rome first appears on Egypt's radar in 273 BC, under the reign of Ptolemy the Second, when we see the first exchange of ambassadors between Egypt and Rome. At this point, the Ptolemaic house is quite strong. So Egypt is certainly in the superior position at this point in time. By the reign of Ptolemy the Fourth, about 60 years later, we see that the Ptolemaic garrison on Crete was commanded by a Roman. By the reign of Ptolemy the Sixth, there's increasing intervention by Rome in the affairs of Egypt. Egypt at this time is involved in a whole series of wars against the Seleucids. And during the Sixth Syrian War, King Antiochus IV invades Egypt. And it's really because of the interaction or the intervention of the Roman legate there that Antiochus is sort of made to leave Egypt. So if the Roman hadn't stepped in, Egypt would have fallen to the Seleucids at this point. And later on, in the reign of Ptolemy the Sixth and his brother Ptolemy the Eighth, Rome is again called on to sort of intervene between these two dueling brothers who were fighting for the throne. So Rome makes the decision of who gets to reign at this point. So by the time of Ptolemy VI, Ptolemy VIII, Egypt finds it very difficult to act independently from Rome. By the time we get to the reign of Ptolemy the Tenth, and it really doesn't help that every king in this period is named Ptolemy, although it kind of makes it easy on one hand, things have gotten so bad that when Ptolemy the Tenth dies, he actually wills his kingdom to Rome. Rather than just step in and take over, the Roman dictator Sulla places a king on the throne. He places King Ptolemy the 11th on the throne, and he puts him on the throne together with someone who's described as his elderly stepmother. Now, if you kind of do the math, I think she's in her 40s, so I think that's kind of a sad thing to say, but anyway. She was quite beloved by the people in Alexandria. She was not so beloved by him, and after 14 days reigning together, he kills her. And not that much longer after that, the Alexandrian mob rips him to pieces. The result of this is that Egypt is left with no king. And Egypt realizes that very soon there will be reprisals from Rome, and very quickly the Alexandrians act, and they place this man, Ptolemy the 12th, on the throne. Now, Ptolemy the 12th very quickly realized the power of Rome, and he spent a tremendous amount of money that he gathered from the Egyptian people through taxes and things like this. He paid heavy bribes to Rome, heavy bribes to Julius Caesar, in fact, and as a result of these bribes, Egypt was officially titled a friend and ally of Rome. Now, the fact that he had paid all this money to Rome didn't make him very popular with the Egyptians, with the Alexandrians in particular. And as a result, he was deposed for a while. He had to flee back to Rome in order to get his throne back. But the Romans themselves weren't all that fond of him either. They sort of looked down on him, and they called him Auletes, meaning the flute player. And the idea that a monarch, a king, would spend his time playing the flute seemed to be a big waste of time in the minds of the Romans. The Egyptians, as I said, also weren't very fond of him, and they had their own nickname for him. They called him Nothos, which means the bastard, which referred to his sort of uncertain lineage. Anyway, after another huge bribe to Rome, he was put back on the throne by Roman legions. And when he died in 51 BC, he had named his 18-year-old daughter and his younger son as his successors. And this daughter was our Cleopatra, Cleopatra the Seventh. So we have this woman who has grown up the first 18 years of her life seeing her father's interactions with Rome, many of which were not very positive. If we jump ahead a few years to her involvement with Julius Caesar, we can see that at this point in time, Rome is involved in a civil war between Pompey and Julius Caesar. Pompey fled for Egypt, hoping that he could find support there, but when he arrives in Egypt, he is killed. Caesar pursues him to Egypt, and when Caesar lands in Egypt, he is horrified to find out that Pompey had been killed by men associated with Ptolemy the 13th. This is Cleopatra's younger brother who's on the throne with her. The young king, Ptolemy the 13th, and his sister Cleopatra are at odds with each other. There's a lot of squabbling about the throne, and Cleopatra flees Alexandria. Caesar becomes involved in these dynastic squabbles, and we all know how this plays out. Ultimately, what happens is that Ptolemy the 13th is killed. Caesar and Cleopatra become romantically involved, and she's placed on the throne again with a second younger brother, Ptolemy the 14th. Now, with Caesar, Cleopatra bears a son. And officially, he is named Ptolemy the 15th, but he is known by his nickname of Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. And when Caesar finally leaves Egypt to return to Rome, Cleopatra follows him with the hope that she can get Rome to continue its friendship with Egypt. She also wants to continue her relationship with Caesar, and really what she wants is for Caesar to recognize that Caesarion is his son. However, Caesar's hands are sort of tied in that matter. He can't marry Cleopatra. He's already married. He has a good Roman wife, Calpurnia. And moreover, as a Roman, he can't have a foreign wife. So, her chances there are pretty slim. While Cleopatra is in Rome with Caesar, on March 14th in 44 BC, Caesar is assassinated. He's murdered. There are more than 60 people that were involved in this conspiracy against him, and this conspiracy was led by Cassius and Brutus, and I'm sure we're all familiar with this event. After Caesar's death, Cleopatra realizes that perhaps being in Rome with Caesarion, the rival to Caesar's legal heir, is maybe not the best place to be. So she returns to Alexandria. Shortly thereafter, she has her 15-year-old half-brother and co-regent, Ptolemy the 14th, right, we're up to 14 now, killed. And then she puts her 3-year-old son, Caesarion, on the throne with her as her co-ruler. Now, after Caesar's death, Rome plunges into a whole series of another civil war, and Cleopatra is faced with this very difficult decision, this very difficult situation. She wants to ally herself with the right side. If she allies herself with the wrong side and they're defeated, then Egypt runs the very real risk of being annexed by Rome, and this is what she is, trying to avoid at all costs. So already by this point in Cleopatra's reign, Rome and Egypt are inextricably linked. And we know that Cleopatra has not endeared herself to the Romans in any way by being involved with Caesar and bearing a child by him. Now, although Caesarion was purported to be his son, Julius Caesar had no living, legitimate male children, and he had adopted his great-nephew, Octavian, as his son and his heir. And at the time of Caesar's death, Octavian was a young man. He was about 19, and he had very little military experience in contrast with the great military career that Caesar had had. Now, the fact that Octavian was chosen over Marc Antony was about 34 at this point and was a seasoned military veteran. He was also a cousin of Caesar's, and he was one of Caesar's closest friends. This came as a bit of a surprise to Marc Antony. And this sets up a conflict between these two men over Caesar's inheritance. Nevertheless, arrangements had to be made for how to govern Rome and Rome's holdings. And in November of 43, the second triumvirate is formed, and Rome's holdings are divided up among 3 men. Octavian will govern the west, Antony will govern the east, and a third man, a man by the name of Lepidus, will govern Hispania and the province of Africa. Now, chief among Marc Antony's interests after the death of Caesar is going to be campaigns in Parthia. At the time of his death, Caesar was getting ready to go on a Parthian campaign. So this is where Marc Antony is going to pick up where Caesar left off. In 41 BC, Antony summons Cleopatra to the city of Tarsus. What Antony wants from this meeting is to ensure Egyptian financial support for these Parthian campaigns. Cleopatra arrives in Tarsus, and she makes her appearance as Aphrodite Isis, and she's surrounded by luxury. Plutarch gives us a description of what happens at this meeting. And Hollywood's version, as you see here with Claudette Colbert, is really hard to beat. In return for financial support for this campaign, Cleopatra has her own demands to make of Antony. And mainly what she's after at this point is revenge. She asks for the death of her sister, Arsinoe IV. She saw Arsinoe as a threat to her position on the throne. So they make this agreement. She'll support him. He'll arrange for the sister to be killed. Cleopatra returns to Alexandria, and Antony follows her. And he spends the winter there. And lo and behold, Cleopatra becomes pregnant. The following year, Cleopatra gives birth to twins, Alexander and Cleopatra. With this action, she's repeating exactly the same thing she had done with Caesar. She's attempting to ensure the continuation of the Ptolemaic dynasty with the goal of reestablishing its former glory. Now, Antony gets word that the Parthians have begun this sort of two-pronged invasion on Roman holdings in Syria and Asia Minor. And he's forced to leave Cleopatra behind and head off to deal with this. While he is heading off to deal with this situation, he finds out that some of his own troops have defected to the Parthians. So that's sort of bad news, number one, or number two. He also learns that his wife, now he is a married man at this time that he's hanging out with Cleopatra, he finds out that his wife, Fulvia, and his brother had launched a campaign, an uprising against Octavian without Antony's knowledge. And they're forced to flee Italy. She dies shortly thereafter. Now, given all of these problems, the problems with the Parthians, the problems with his troops defecting, the problems with his wife and brother, Cleopatra is the least of his worries, and he doesn't see her again for 4 years. Now, the actions of Fulvia and Marc Antony's brother bring Octavian and Antony to sort of open hostility. But they wind up reconciling in 40 BC, and their agreement is incorporated into the Treaty of Brundisium. And it's agreed at this treaty that the triumvirate that had been set up a number of years before, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, would continue for the remainder of its 5 years. And then another part of the treaty that was sort of really bad from Cleopatra's point of view, because she had just seen Fulvia die, was that Antony agreed to marry Octavia, the sister of Octavian. Octavia is young, she's beautiful, she's intelligent, she's dedicated to the home life. She is the perfect Roman wife. And she stands in marked contrast to the Roman view of how Cleopatra was. So, in 37 BC, Antony again summons Cleopatra to meet him. This time, they meet in the city of Antioch. And his reasons for wanting to get to meet with her are sort of similar to what they were when they met in 41 BC. Of course, they're going to renew their relationship. He's going to ask for her financial support for his battles against the Parthians. And we'll see that Octavian had promised to give Antony troops, 20,000 troops, and he hasn't come up with this number at all. And this is making Antony really appreciate Octavia a little less than he might have if Octavian had come up with the men that he needed. So that's what Antony wants. We saw that the last time there was a quid pro quo on Cleopatra's side, and this time what she wants is land. The last time they met, she was after revenge. This time, she wants to increase the Ptolemaic land holdings, and she asks for lands that at one point were part of the Ptolemaic Empire, but had been lost to Rome. And Antony gives them to her. These are lands that are mostly in the Levant, and what these lands share is the fact that they're all in good forested regions. And this is going to be part of Cleopatra's help with the Parthian campaigns. She is going to have ships built. The ancient Egyptians were fantastic shipbuilders and had been for thousands of years prior to the reign of Cleopatra. So she's going to have these ships built, and this will help him with the campaign. And you might say, well, why? Parthia is landlocked, why do we need ships? But these ships can be used in the Eastern Mediterranean to make sure that nothing bad is coming from the back end. So at this point, also at this meeting, or as a result of this meeting, Cleopatra's Children by Antony take the stage. These twins, Alexander and Alexander and Cleopatra had been born in 40 BC. When Antony gives over all the land, these lands to Cleopatra, he also acknowledges that these children are his. And at this time, the children receive new names. So Alexander becomes Alexander Helios, meaning the sun, and Cleopatra becomes Cleopatra Selene, meaning the moon. Now, Antony is again taken up with campaigns with the Parthians, and this was so important because by defeating the Parthians, he would have proved himself to be the true successor to Caesar. This was what Caesar was aiming to do when he was assassinated. If Antony were able to defeat the Parthians, this would be far greater than anything Octavian would be able to do. Cleopatra has interest in this as well because the Parthians border lands that are now Ptolemaic holdings, so they are a threat to her as well. So in 36 BC, he sets out on a long march through Armenia and Media en route to Parthia, so he's coming in through this area here. And what he decides to do is sort of a grave error. He splits his forces up into two groups. One group goes on ahead. The second group, which has all the battle equipment, the siege equipment and stuff like that, which is slowing the rest of the group down, is sort of left behind. And he winds up being duped. There's a sort of traitor in the midst. This second let's call it a battalion, whatever. So the second group is attacked, and all of the siege equipment is burned, troops are killed. This is sort of a crushing defeat for him. When he finally makes his way back, he is wound up losing 2/5 of his troops. So this is a crushing defeat for him. This is something Antony had not experienced before. He's heavily criticized for this. He is criticized for having waited too long to attack. Winter has come. It's a bad time of year to do this. He was criticized for being tricked and for allowing his men to be at risk. And he's also blamed for wanting to hurry back to see Cleopatra. He left his army midway back and hurried off to meet up with her. Now, why does he do this? Well, some could say he's besotted with love. Others could say he's just lost 2/5 of his army and all of his siege equipment, and he needs money and support to continue his operations. She has also just given birth to their third child, a son by the name of Ptolemy Philadelphus. So now at the same time that Antony is having all of these disappointments, Octavian is having military success, and this is not the way it was supposed to be playing out. Antony is the one with all the experience. He's supposed to be the military genius, and Octavian was the one without any experience. So this is a problem. Also at the same time, there are problems with the third triumvir, Lepidus. He doesn't want to acknowledge Octavian's supremacy, and as a result, Lepidus is dismissed and sent off into retirement. And this decision was made by Octavian without any consultation with Antony. So this is troubling to Antony. So things are beginning to come to a head, if you will. Octavian also arranges another embarrassment for Antony. Antony hears that Octavia, his wife, is heading to Athens to help him out with clothing, with supplies for his army, with ships, and she's also bringing 2,000 troops. This is bad. Antony doesn't need 2,000 troops. He was promised 20,000 troops. And so he really needs men now that most of his army has been, or a good part of his army has been decimated. Octavia wants to meet him there together with the stuff that she's bringing. Instead, he sends her a letter saying, send the supplies on, but you should go back to Rome and stay home. So long-suffering Octavia had again been abandoned by Antony for Cleopatra. Now, in 35 BC, things begin to turn a little bit better for Antony. He launches a successful attack on the Armenians, and this is an area, if you recall the map, that would need to be under his control in order to have success in the Parthian campaign. So he is successful with this attack. And in 34 BC, upon his return to Alexandria, he celebrates a celebration. He stages a celebration in the city that is along the lines of a Roman triumph. So a parade where the captured king was going to be brought through the streets in chains and this kind of thing. This event angers the Romans. They viewed this, the success over the Armenians as a Roman victory. It should have been celebrated in Rome, not in Alexandria, not in Egypt. So the Romans are angry with this. The next thing that Antony and Cleopatra do really gain them no friends at all in Rome. This is an event known as the Donations of Alexandria. Now, for this event, and this takes place in Alexandria, in the gymnasium, in the middle of the city, Cleopatra is dressed as Isis, and their children, are dressed in costumes that are representative of areas that are going to be granted to them by Antony. So the children are arrayed there on little thrones. Cleopatra is dressed as Isis Aphrodite, and Antony is bedecked as Dionysus Osiris. At this time, Antony declares that these events are being celebrated in honor of Julius Caesar. He then gives a long list of honors, long list of titles, and a long list of territories that he's going to be giving over to Cleopatra and the children. And so, as we see here, Alexander Helios, their 6-year-old son, is declared king of Media and Armenia and the Parthian Empire. Now, the Parthian Empire hasn't actually been conquered yet, but no mind. Ptolemy Philadelphus, who's 2, he's given territories, the Syrian territories. He's the overlord of client kings from the Euphrates to the Hellespont. Cleopatra Selene, who is also 6, she's made queen of the Cyrenaica and Crete. These are areas that had been under Roman control. This is going to be a problem. This is going to really annoy Octavian. Ptolemy the 15th, that is Caesarion, is declared king of kings. He is made overlord with Cleopatra over all of the areas that his brothers and sisters rule. And at the same time, Antony declares that Caesarion was Caesar's legitimate son. And you can hear the noise in Rome at this announcement. So how do these things play out? How is this news received? Well, in the East, where these areas had been promised, areas that had not yet been won, it doesn't seem to be that much of a problem. But in Rome, it certainly gave much fuel to the fire for Octavian's hatred of Antony and Cleopatra. These were clearly Antony and Cleopatra's long-reaching goals and plans for the future. So this was a huge misstep on their part. And the Donations of Alexandria are often seen as sort of the beginning cause for the Battle of Actium. Now, as if this weren't bad enough, Antony's next misstep is to officially divorce Octavia by means of a letter. So he spurns Octavian's sister in favor of Cleopatra, whom he seems to have married even before divorcing Octavia. Octavian then lucks out. There are 2 important supporters of Antony who defect, go over to Octavian's side, and they let Octavian know that the Vestal Virgins in Rome are holding a copy of Antony's will. Now, if your will is being held by the Vestal Virgins, it's supposed to be, in a place where no one can get it. Octavian manages to illegally seize the will and have it read, supposedly. And what it says in the will is that, again, Antony recognizes that Cleopatra's son, Caesarion, is Caesar's legal heir. He leaves large inheritances of land to his children by Cleopatra. So he's not leaving these things to Rome, he's leaving them to Egypt. And he indicates in the will his desire to be buried with Cleopatra in Alexandria. So as if there was any doubt on where where his support lie, clearly it lay with Egypt, not with Rome. In 32 BC, Octavian declares war on Cleopatra in the name of Rome. And he personally performs the ancient Roman ritual for declaration of war, which involved going to a small plot of land located right outside of the Temple of Bellona, the Roman war goddess. And this small plot of land is designated as enemy territory. An arrow is shot into the plot of land, and thus war begins. And the important point here is that war is declared against Cleopatra, not against Antony. But of course, he's going to be heavily involved in this. And now we see that the road to Actium is paved, and there is no turning back. In 31 BC, the war starts. Marc Antony stationed his navy and his troops all along the western coast of Greece. Agrippa, whom you see here, Octavian's great admiral, crossed the Ionian Sea and pounced on Antony's base at Methone and overcame it. And all summer long, these two armies confronted one another, and one by one, Octavian and Agrippa overtook Antony's bases. Now, whether they took them and kept them, or whether they were able to just take them long enough to disrupt Antony's lines of communication, Antony's supply routes, and things like this is sort of up for debate. But in any case, it was a definite disturbance. Marc Antony took his and Cleopatra's fleet and had the fleet stationed inside the Gulf of Ambracia, who you see here. He was positioned on the southern side, and Octavian set up camp on the northernmost side of the Gulf. This is a terrible location. Antony has, by this point, whoops, you don't need to see that one yet, has lost access to the sea, fresh water in this area, it's hard to come by, and his troops are becoming ill, and so this is becoming what has been described as sort of a desperate situation. It may not have been as bad as it has sometimes been described, but it's not an ideal location. Antony tries to induce Octavian's troops on the northern side to engage in a land battle, but this is not met with success. In early August, he tries to break out. He sends a land force north. He hopes he can sort of deflect attention away from the fleet and they can escape out of the Gulf. His fleet tries to break out, but they're battled back. The land troops, make their way back to Antony. And as a result, one of his generals defects to Octavian. So he is beginning to lose support from his innermost core there. Now, during the time that Antony and his troops are sort of blockaded in there, tensions seem to be mounting between Antony, his generals, and his wife. Now you can see this slide. Presumably because she was probably planning the battle in this way here, in her bathtub in the nude. They realized, the generals seemed to realize that as long as Cleopatra was present there in the Gulf, she and Antony would be fuel for Octavian's propaganda. There's also this debate that seems to be going on between whether it should be a land battle or whether it should be a sea battle. And Antony's generals seem to be much more in favor of a land battle. Antony is more experienced on land than he is at sea. But if they have a land battle, that means they have to abandon the ships. And Cleopatra seems to be strongly opposed to this idea. So they go back and forth about land or sea, land or sea. And finally, the decision is made to fight a naval battle. And here's where even more of this uncertainty about what actually happens during the battle comes about. We know that during the 16 weeks that they're trapped here in the Gulf, there's a lot of debate. We know for sure that there was a traitor in the midst of Antony's war council, someone who went and reported to Octavian and to Agrippa what Marc Antony and Cleopatra's plan was. What isn't clear to us is what was the plan. Was the plan to fight a naval battle, fight it as if they're going to win it? So go at it with, all loaded for bear, whatever the expression might be. Or was the plan to flee the battle without engaging the enemy, with the hopes of regrouping later and fighting another battle on land in another location? Now, we know that Antony ordered sails to be brought aboard the ships. And this was something that you wouldn't typically do if you were engaged in a naval battle, because the sails are heavy, they're going to weigh the ships down, the ships are going to be harder to maneuver. So was this a sign that he planned to flee all along? Or was this a third option, that he did plan to fight, but he wanted to have the option of flight if it came to that? The other uncertainty is, were Marc Antony and Cleopatra of one mind in the plan? Did they agree on what the plan was, whatever the plan was? We also aren't sure how many ships each side had. If you look at the ancient records, the numbers differ wildly. And some sources say that Antony had only half as many ships as Octavian did, whereas other people who look at these sources say, well, Octavian had a few more ships, but the ships that Antony had were bigger, so maybe it wasn't quite as unequal as it seems. So there are uncertainties about the battle. What we do know is that on September 2nd, 31 BC, the Battle of Actium took place. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet began to row sort of single file out of the Gulf where they had been trapped. And before Octavian had heard what the plan is, and we're not really sure what the plan is, he had wanted to let them come out into open waters and overtake them at sea. But whatever he learned of this plan caused him to change his mind and come up with a different strategy. So that when Cleopatra and Antony came out of the Gulf here, they were confronted with Octavian's ships sort of surrounding them in a half circle. And so they're faced with Octavian's fleet right away. Now, Octavian's fleet might have been slightly larger in number, but again, the ships may have been smaller. The ships that Antony had were mostly these massive quinqueremes that you see here at the bottom. These were huge ships, and the way that these ships worked was with these massive rams that could sort of smash through other ships. And they were also sort of heavily protected, so in order to prevent ships with similar equipment from ramming into them. Octavian's fleet had a bit of an advantage in that his ships were these smaller ships that you see here that were more easily maneuverable. And it's also been suggested that his troops were not quite as run down as Antony's were. Antony's, remember, they have been stuck for 16 weeks in this swamp. So anyway, this is sort of comparing the two fleets. We do know that Cleopatra's ship, the ship that she was on, contained all of the treasure, and it was at a protected position, sort of at the rear here. Shortly after midday, Antony was sort of forced to engage with the enemy. So the battle begins, and you see this lovely image of how nice it looked. And all of a sudden, in the midst of battle, Cleopatra's ship disengages from action and takes off south, while the rest of the ships remain locked in battle. Now the question is, was this part of the original plan? Or did Cleopatra panic and, for whatever reason, decide to leave the fighting? Or had she secretly planned all along to leave Antony and the battle raging? What happens next is that Antony is, of course, having a drink. We've heard from Plutarch what a good drinker he is. He notices Cleopatra's ship taking off, and what does he do? His ship disengages from battle and follows her. Was this part of the plan? Did they make this agreement that he would follow her? Or is he so besotted by love with her that he has to follow her? We just don't know. The result is that the rest of his ships continue to fight without their two leaders there. A number of his ships were sunk. The rest either returned to the Gulf, where they were captured by Octavian, or they just surrendered right there at sea. Cleopatra hurries back to Egypt, and perhaps, the way her ship, so you see Cleopatra goes directly back to Egypt. Antony takes a slightly less direct route and winds up here first, thinking that maybe Octavian's ships are going to follow and attack, so he waits here for a while. When Cleopatra heads back to Alexandria to head into the harbor there, her ship is bedecked with all kinds of garlands and things like this, as if there had been a great victory at sea, and we were supposed to be led to believe that this would fool the Alexandrians. Others argue that Cleopatra's ship is holding Isis. Cleopatra is Isis, and her ship would always be decorated in this fashion. In any case, what Cleopatra does next is pretty much prepare for what she knows will be the inevitable clash between Egypt and Rome. She has her son, Caesarion, and Marc Antony's son, Antyllus. She has them both celebrate their coming-of-age celebration. This way, if something happens to Cleopatra, the Egyptians will have an adult king, a grown man as king. And this is problematic, though, because boys are much less of a threat than grown men were. She also decides to send Caesarion away. So she is making plans to secure the dynasty in the event of her death. She makes arrangements for him to leave Egypt and to head south to Coptos, where he can eventually make his way, hopefully, to India and sort of wait things out. Octavian now heads toward Egypt. He marches down the coast. He takes Pelusium here, makes his way to Alexandria. Antony now knows that the time has come to engage Octavian in battle. Antony attacks Octavian's advance force, and they retreat, but this is really just a minor victory. Antony's fleet sailed out of Alexandria to engage with the enemy ships, but what the ships do is they immediately surrender to Octavian. His army also surrenders. They flee. So he is now left with no army, no navy, no support. Octavian enters Alexandria. Cleopatra now locks herself up with her treasure in the tomb that she has arranged. She sends a message to Antony that she has killed herself, and Antony believes that she's dead, and he orders his servant to kill him. And the servant panics or whatever, and he kills himself instead. Antony then falls on his blade, but he botches the job, and he doesn't die instantly. And Cleopatra's secretary, someone, then comes to tell him that Cleopatra is actually alive. Does this sound like a familiar story to you? Two servants wind up bringing Antony to Cleopatra. He's hoisted up through a window, and we're told that he dies in her arms. Cleopatra is then taken prisoner by Octavian's guards, and she's given permission to leave in order to attend Antony's funeral. She falls ill, and rather than be put, somewhere bad, she's moved to the palace. Octavian wants her healthy. He wants to be able to parade her through the streets of Rome in chains when he celebrates his triumph. On October 12th, Cleopatra asks that a message be brought to Octavian. It's a request that she be buried next to Antony. And as soon as Octavian sees this message, he knows it means that she's killed herself. And sure enough, in the palace she is found, dead on the couch in her royal robes, and her two maids who were with her are also dying. So she had killed herself. Now the question is how? How did she do it? This answer isn't known and may never be known. Was it through snake bite or was it by poison? Rumors, that you can read in some of the ancient sources that Cleopatra, she was so bloodthirsty, she did test out different poisons on condemned prisoners to find out which were the quickest and which were the most painless. If we look at some of the ancient sources describing Cleopatra's body after her death, some describe the only marks on her body as being two small pricks on her arm. So did these come from the bite of a snake, or was this some sort of pin that had poison in it that she had, sort of injected into herself? If we buy the snake theory, there are quite a number of candidates for poisonous and deadly snakes in Egypt. We have, of course, the Egyptian cobra, and we also have a number of vipers who are very deadly. This one here, the horned viper, we actually encountered our last trip to Abydos. We steered clear of it. We didn't play Marc Antony and Cleopatra with it. So if it was by a snake that Cleopatra died, this would be sort of a perfectly logical and perfectly symbolic death, although not a very pleasant one, because if you read the descriptions of what happens to a person after they are bitten by either one of these snakes, it's not very pleasant. But the snake for the ancient Egyptians, particularly the cobra, was a symbol of royalty. If you think of the ancient Egyptian kings, they all wear the rearing uraeus at their brow. Think of the mask of Tutankhamun. And the statues that we have of Cleopatra that have been identified as Cleopatra, even though they don't have her name on them, have been identified because at the brow she has not one snake, but three uraei. So it's this triple uraei. It seems to be indicative of images of Cleopatra. So this idea of the snake is something that clearly was part of her thinking, from early on in her reign because of its importance in Egyptian religion and in Egyptian thoughts about Egyptian kingship. So here are three images of Cleopatra with those triple uraei. So with the death of Cleopatra, we come to the end of 3,000 years of pharaonic history. She is the last ruler of Egypt. In 27 BC, Octavian becomes Augustus Caesar. We see that there are coins issued celebrating the victory over Egypt with the text reading "Captured Egypt," emblazoned around the crocodile, which was a symbol of the Nile. After their suicides, Octavian continues with this campaign to discredit the memory of this queen who had come so close to toppling Rome. And even long after her death, Cleopatra is attacked, and there is this oil lamp that has a rather crude depiction on it that has often been identified as Cleopatra. So you have a female figure here on top of a crocodile here, obviously symbolizing Egypt, and then you'll notice something that is not exactly the way crocodiles look, sort of servicing Cleopatra there. So this was a statement, perhaps, about the queen long after her death. So what happens in Egypt? Well, when Egypt becomes part of Rome, it wasn't treated as a normal Roman province. It was considered to be the property of the emperor. No Roman senator could set foot in Egypt without the express permission of the Roman emperor. Egypt was administered by a prefect who was put in place by the emperor. Rome could no longer feed itself. Egypt becomes sort of the breadbasket for Rome. And it can be argued that Rome, sort of slowly bleeds Egypt dry. Roman emperors didn't rule in Egypt. They didn't rule from Egypt. But they did have themselves portrayed on temple walls in traditional Egyptian fashion. So here, from the very beginning of Egyptian history, you have this smiting scene on the Narmer palette showing King Narmer smiting enemies. And here, from the temple at Esna, you have an image of the Emperor Trajan, so 3,000 plus years later, shown in exactly that same smiting pose. So the emperors were happy to sort of take on some of this, this iconography. We see that for a number of years, for a while there, Egyptian religion continued without sort of interruption. And the gods, you see Anubis, you see Horus, they continued to be worshipped in Roman Egypt. Now they just wear different clothes. So they're... What really kind of causes the death knell for ancient Egypt when it's taken over by Rome is really when Rome decides to outlaw paganism. And by paganism, we mean Egyptian religion. And we find that temples are closed throughout Egypt. We find that in Egypt, traditionally, the temples, the priests that serviced the temples, those were the people who were literate in hieroglyphs and could do a lot of the reading and writing. Once you close the temple, the priests are out of the job, there's no need for hieroglyphs to be written, to be read. You begin to lose the ability to read and write in hieroglyphs, and in fact, that's what happens. The last datable hieroglyphic inscription we have appears at Philae Temple in 394 CE. So, and then at this point, the ability to read hieroglyphs is lost until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799 and its eventual translation by Champollion in 1822. We also see the death of another Egyptian language, the language of Demotic, which had been in use in Egypt from the 7th century BC. Demotic also was sort of killed off during the Roman period. The Romans didn't grant Demotic an official status as a language. Greek was the language, and this becomes sort of a disaster for Egyptian culture and Egyptian identity. And here you see the last Demotic inscription. So to sort of sum up, as an Egyptologist, I may be a little biased, but it's not very hard to argue with the ultimate location of this statue, this head of Augustus. Presumably, this statue had been set up somewhere in Egypt, but at some point, it had been taken all the way south into Nubia, down to Meroe, where it had been buried in a temple there under a threshold, so that symbolically, magically, forever, everyone who stepped over or on that threshold would be crushing and trampling Octavian for all of eternity. So there we are, from Actium to an asp, the end of Cleopatra.